Of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to submit extraneous materials on the subject of this special order.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commemorate the life and honor the service of a murdered New York City police officer, Jonathan Diller. I rise today also to honor his wife, Stephanie, and his 1-year-old son, Ryan. They both will spend the rest of their lives reeling from the loss of a beloved husband and father in a way that none of us can fully understand. Jonathan Diller's death is a national tragedy. It's an indescribable loss, not only for his family, for Long Island, for the great state of New York, but for the United States of America and law enforcement in every corner of this globe. Horrifically, Officer Diller's death is not the only death endured by the NYPD in recent memory. Mr. Speaker, I rise today as well to honor the lives and service of Anastasios Tsakos, Jason Rivera, Wilbert Mora, Adid Fayez. We pray for these slain NYPD heroes and their families, and we remind those retired and those serving here in the House of Representatives that we will always stand with the men and women of law enforcement. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor as well the some 374 officers slain in the line of duty since President Biden began to steadily chip away at law and order in this country since 2021. President Biden and allied politicians in governors' mansions, district attorneys' offices, and right here in the House of Representatives may pay lip service to these officers and their families, but their votes, their rhetoric, their spewing of hatred tell a very different story. You see, Mr. Speaker, there is a reason why Governor Hochul's presence was universally rebuked by those, including myself, in attendance at now Detective First Grade Diller's wake. The reason, Mr. Speaker? Governor Hochul and far-left lawmakers have, at every single turn, prioritized equity over the lives of men and women who wear the uniform. They have pursued disastrous pro-criminal policies when they could have and should have pursued public safety. As a result, brave public servants and innocent Americans are paying the price in blood. And we have, thankfully, across this country, many organizations who support men and women in blue in some of our worst times. And some of them are here with us today. I want to thank Project Thank a Cop for being here and always supporting men and women in blue. See, public safety is not rocket science. So when we witness record assaults and attacks against law enforcement officers, we begin to look at those in power in these places and wonder, why are they choosing to allow this to happen? When Americans and New Yorkers watch videos of illegal migrants brutally beating NYPD officers in Times Square, we begin to look at those in power and wonder why they choose to allow these people to be here in the first place. Just minutes ago, the New York Post issued another article. It's titled, "Migrant Repeat Offenders Viciously Attack Cops During Bust for Ransacking a New York City Target." Whether it's cashless bail or open borders, the common denominator among these stories is radical, progressive policy. And the American people know, see, and suffer this reality. You see, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, I shouldn't say all of them, but some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are no doubt aware that the animal who shot Officer Diller had 21 prior arrests. 21 prior arrests for charges ranging from drug convictions to assault to hate crimes. When someone like Detective Diller's killer can commit heinous acts of violence, be apprehended, and then let out on the street the same day, we have a problem. Mr. Speaker, that problem lies not with the police, not with the men and women of law enforcement, not with the men and women who put on that shield and that gun belt every day. Mr. Speaker, it lies with elected officials who have no regard for public safety. Time and time again, those elected officials have chosen to preserve this revolving door of criminality through their explicit embrace of policies like cashless bail and open borders. The American people know that it does not need to be this way, that it was not this way until very recently, until those in power changed course. Mr. Speaker, nightmares like those of Officer Diller will continue to occupy our headlines and our hearts. And you see, in places like New York, and you're going to hear from other members from the great state of New York tonight, not only is our state legislature and our governor all run by Democrats, not only are they saying that cashless bail is working, that criminal justice reform is working, they are doubling down and saying that it is better for the city and the state of New York. Mr. Speaker, I plead with my colleagues in all branches of government to come to their senses. I humbly ask that they listen to law enforcement experts. Give them the tools they need. Do not take the handcuffs from their gun belt that they're supposed to be utilizing against criminals and use it on them. Let them do their jobs. I ask that they change course, that they understand in their reckless pursuit of equity and social justice, they are hurting those trying to protect. In my years as an NYPD detective, I saw enough death and suffering. We don't need to see more. And Mr. Speaker, that morning just a week ago, when Stephanie Diller gave the eulogy of her hero husband, she mentioned the funerals of police officer Mora and Rivera and referenced the speakers who said that we needed change. And she asked a simple question to those elected officials that were in that church in Massapequa, and of course, to the thousands upon thousands in the streets and the thousands listening at home. And she asked a simple question: what has changed? And the answer in places like New York, that's run by Democrats, the answer is nothing. Nothing has changed in our pursuit of justice. The only thing that has changed is people's lives have become more dangerous. Our streets have become more dangerous. We don't need to see more death and suffering. We don't need to see more nightmares like first-grade Detective Diller. Mr. Speaker, I now yield 5 minutes to my colleague from New York, Congresswoman Malliotakis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague, Anthony D'Esposito, and thank you for your service, Anthony, and for highlighting the dangers that our law enforcement face each and every day. As a representative from New York City, it breaks my heart to see that we are losing police officers year after year, not just to retirements and those who are fleeing our state, but those who are being murdered by criminals who should not be on our streets. We talked about how 374 police officers have been killed in the line of duty since Joe Biden became president in 2021. That includes 5 of our brave NYPD. Detective Sakos, Detective Rivera, Detective Mora, Officer Fayez, and of course, the latest being Officer Jonathan Diller. We must listen to the words and the pleas of their widows, of their parents, of their family members, of their fellow law enforcement officers who are saying that this is preventable. And if we see that our police officers are not safe in cities like ours, how can the public be safe? It's truly tragic because we know it's preventable. And there are a certain number of laws that the state legislature in New York have put in place that have caused this crisis. The individuals who were responsible for the death of Officer Diller, they were career criminals. Guy Rivera, who is the one who pulled the trigger, he had 21 prior arrests, and he was still on our streets. He was most recently released from a 5-year prison stint for a drug conviction, and then he went off to parole in 2022. But he was on the streets because of a new law that the legislature passed called Less is More Act. He had parole violations, but he wasn't in jail. And that's because of the actions of our governor and the state legislature. His partner, the other perp, was arrested at least 14 times for things like robbery, assault, even attempted murder in 2001. He was sentenced to a decade behind bars, but guess what? He's back on the street, and in April, he was caught with a loaded illegal gun. The DA sought bail, but the judge agreed on bail, but not for monitoring. And so he made the bail and was released back onto our streets again. It is so tragic to see that these laws put in place by our legislature have caused the death of these police officers, but New Yorkers are being hurt each and every day by people who have not a dozen, not 2 dozen, not 3 dozen, sometimes even 4 dozen prior arrests, and they are still on the streets because of the revolving door. We just heard of another cop who was hospitalized last week after being attacked by 6 migrants at a Target in the Upper East Side. Once again, lawlessness is taking over the streets of New York City. And what you're seeing taking place is a combination of the policies of this president, open border policies, the policies of our left-leaning state legislature with the bail reform, the raise the age, as well as the Less and More Act, and couple it with the city policy that handcuffs the NYPD and doesn't allow for any cooperation for individuals who are committing crimes to be deported or at least detained. If ICE makes a detainer request for these individuals, which they have, the city won't comply. They'll just release them back on the street so they can continue wreaking havoc in our city, in our country. That is wrong. And it's not going to stop. We're not going to bring public safety to the streets of the city or this country unless we change these policies. And so the left-leaning Democrats who continue to vote for these policies, support these policies, refuse to repeal or even adjust or fix these policies, we're speaking to you tonight, and we are echoing what the widows and the children and the parents and the family members and the community where these police officers are and the millions of crime victims we are seeing across our country reside. They want action, they want it now, and we must continue to fight for it, and we won't stop until we get cooperation from the other side of the aisle. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield some time to my good friend from Indiana, Ms. Houchin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today with a heavy heart to address the tragic murder of NYPD Officer Jonathan Diller, whose life was senselessly taken while serving his community. This heinous act of violence not only took the life of a dedicated officer, but also serves as a stark reminder of the dangers our law enforcement officers face every day. Guy Rivera and Lindley Jones, the perpetrators of this despicable crime, are no strangers to the criminal justice system. With extensive criminal histories, including prior arrests for violent offenses, Rivera and Jones epitomize the threat posed by our repeat offenders who continue to roam our streets despite arrest after arrest after arrest after arrest. Officer Diller's death clearly exposes the threat that soft on-crime policies in Democrat-led cities have brought to communities across the country. These atrocities have enabled individuals like Rivera and Jones to evade accountability and continue to live freely while law-abiding citizens and our brave men and women in law enforcement pay the price. As we mourn the loss of Officer Diller, we must also demand action and policies to restore accountability in our criminal justice system, to support crime victims, and prioritize the safety of our communities and our law enforcement officers. I urge my colleagues to join me in calling for meaningful change to prevent tragedies like this from ever happening again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield some time to my good friend from New York, Mr. Williams.
Thank you. I'm proud to join my colleagues from New York, and particularly a veteran of the New York Police Department, Mr. D'Esposito. Before serving this august body, served his neighbors and helped keep them safe. He speaks out of passion and experience on this critical topic. This is a time of soul-crushing grief for the Diller family. You know, I can't feel what you feel, but I can say this: you are not alone. Across America, people are standing up, and they are saying that this senseless violence has to stop. It cannot go on. When New York City and Albany turned their backs, letting someone with 21 prior arrests back on the street, Massapequa Park was left to pick up the pieces, left to ask questions like, how many crimes does someone have to commit? How many people does someone have to threaten to kill before you make sure they don't have the opportunity to do more damage? They want to know why, time and again, dangerous, violent criminals who public servants have the responsibility to remove from society, these people are instead free to victimize more innocent people, like Officer Diller. They want to know why they have to suffer, while career criminals so often avoid real consequences. There is so much more that we must do at the policy level to prevent more tragedies like these from occurring, to prevent career criminals from destroying families like this one. Radical policies like no cash bail cannot continue. Willful ignorance from elected officials cannot continue. Preventable killings like this one simply cannot continue. And we cannot stop working until we reach the day when our nation's police officers and their families, in fact, when all decent, law-abiding folks who are just trying to get along and do the right things, when these people are able to trust that their elected officials here and at the local level truly have their back, may that day come soon. Stephanie and little Ryan, my heart breaks for you. America lost a hero, but you lost a husband and a father who was serving selflessly. And through his selfless dedication, we will not forget. Mr. Speaker, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield a few minutes to my good friend from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
First and foremost, Jonathan Diller is an American hero. A hero whose wife will not have to grow old. She will grow old without a husband whom she loves so much. A hero whose 1-year-old son will grow up without a dad. And yet what makes this tragedy so gut-wrenching, so horrible, so foul, is the fact that it was 100% avoidable. It did not have to happen. What kind of a society are we when we let individuals who have been arrested 14 times, 20 times, more times than even that, and we keep sending them back out to roam the streets and hurt our good American citizens? What kind of a society are we when we prioritize identity politics over the safety of the American public and our law enforcement officers? This is a dangerous pattern that we see in New York, but it's all across the country. The left continues to vilify our law enforcement. The left continues to undermine or outright ignore the laws meant to protect our American citizens. The left continues to push weak on crime laws and elect weak on crime district attorneys, and that's where the blame goes. This isn't a matter of policy differences. This is a matter of good versus evil, right versus wrong, law and order versus criminality and chaos. And it cost Jonathan Diller, an American hero serving his community, it cost him his life. How many times must we lose good Americans before people wake up? And we must realize that we need to stand up for our law enforcement officers. How many families must suffer a loss and a loved one before we continue to say enough is enough, that this is it, we've had it, this is the time, this is the place. And it has to be more than words. It has to be more than resolutions. It has to be in change. And we need to make that change now. We cannot allow brave men like Jonathan Diller to die in the future. Our police already have one of the hardest jobs that anyone could imagine. We cannot make their lives harder by defunding them. We cannot make their lives harder by demeaning them. We cannot make their lives harder by demonizing them. We can make their lives harder by allowing career criminals to stay out of jail over and over and over again. We are a nation of laws, and we owe a tremendous debt to those men and women who enforce those laws. And we owe it to them. We owe it to them to pass laws that ensure that they are properly funded, and to enforce laws that keep the bad guys off the streets. I thank Officer Diller. I thank him for his brave service, and I'm praying, we all are. America is praying for his family. But as I said before, that is not enough. We must make the change. I thank my friend, Congressman Anthony D'Esposito, for bringing us all together today. And I thank him for his good work. And Speaker, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I yield some time to my good friend from California, Mr. Garcia. Thanks, brother.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in solidarity with my good friend from New York, and I want to thank him for his service before coming to Congress as a law enforcement officer. And most importantly, I want to stand here today in support of our law enforcement who are currently wearing the uniform. We have similar problems in California as New York does. And these brave men and women who wake up every morning and think about the sobering and very realistic thought that today may actually be the last day of their life. And despite having that realization every morning, the realization that they may have to deal with someone who will literally try to kill them, they still get up, they still put on that uniform, and they proudly serve our communities. They do it despite the radical policies like defunding the police, despite the lunatics dressed in suits disguised as DAs like our own district attorney in Los Angeles County, who goes by the name of George Gascon. Gascon, instead of being the DA, is more like a defense attorney rather than a district attorney. He's more like the Penguin of Gotham City, who enables the deaths of his constituents and puts our sheriffs and LAPD officers' lives at risk every day. He helps the bad guys instead of protecting the innocent, instead of allowing the police to do their job. He allows for early release of felons, downgraded or no charges at all of serious offenses, most of them felonies, and zero cash bail policies instead of supporting law enforcement and law-abiding citizens. The brave peacemakers in blue wake up every morning and serve despite the fact that they are working double overtime because our county supervisors and our mayors aren't hiring enough new cadets into the academies. They get up and put their lives on the line on a daily basis despite their own elected officials who are supposed to represent them at all levels of government not supporting them. They also suffered disproportionately high divorce rates and, unfortunately, astronomical suicide rates. In my district alone, we saw 4 law enforcement officers commit suicide in just 1 week. But to the 708,000 police officers, please know this: the good guys have your back. As a former combat naval aviator and the son of an LAPD officer, I know the dangers you face on a daily basis, and I appreciate your courage and your sacrifice and that of your families. The fear your families face on a daily basis, the reality that some of you may not come home at night because evil still does exist on our streets. We are eternally grateful to you, and most people in our communities are. Each year, more than 100 cops give their lives in our defense. Last year, 136 cops were killed in the line of duty. Someone doesn't need to become a cop, or someone doesn't want to become a cop. They don't do it for the money. They don't do it for the benefits. They do it because they want to serve. They want to protect. They want to do what is right and what is noble. And there is no greater form of love than being willing to give your own life in defense of another human being. And for many of us, that's true for our kids. That's true for our spouses or close friends. We would die for them. But the amazing thing about law enforcement officers is that they wake up every morning willing to give up their lives in defense of complete strangers. That's extremely powerful, and that should be very humbling to the rest of us. The least we can do as elected officials at all levels of government is to give our law enforcement officers every dollar of funding and every policy tool to make sure that they come home at night and that the bad guys go to prison. And we should never bend the knee. Never bend the knee to an organization or human being that supports defunding or jeopardizing the lives of our police officers. I urge leadership in this body, the House of Representatives, to bring my bill, the Sergeant Steve Owen bill, to the floor for a vote. Sergeant Steve Owen, who's pictured here, was a brave sheriff who was brutally executed in broad daylight in the Antelope Valley, just like Deputy Ryan Klinkenbroomer, who is also pictured here, was shot in the head while sitting in his patrol car in the afternoon in the Antelope Valley. The Sergeant Steve Owen bill would make the intentional killing of a cop a federal felony with a punishment no less than the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. This should be the law of the land in all 50 states. And Mr. Speaker, we should all agree that that's a reasonable law. This is a reasonable punishment for such evil. May God look over our peacemakers, and I want to thank my colleague from New York for putting this special order on. And may the lawmakers and the district attorneys, the elected officials, do their jobs and take care of those who provide our communities with our security blankets on a daily basis. God bless our law enforcement officers. God bless this country, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Mr. Speaker, I now yield some time to my good friend from New Jersey, Mr. Kane.
Thank you to my good friend and former NYPD detective, Anthony D'Esposito, for holding this special order today to honor the life and the memory of New York City police officer Jonathan Diller. On March 25th, 2024, during a routine traffic stop in Queens, New York, Officer Diller was shot by a man with 21 prior arrests who was released on parole just 3 years ago. The fact that this killer was able to be released on parole should be a shock to anyone and is unfortunately endemic to the soft on-crime policies that extreme Democrats are pushing across the country. This tragedy was entirely avoidable, and we as leaders must act to ensure that it does not happen again. I rise today to honor a young man who is a credit to his community and to his profession. During his 3 years in the NYPD, Officer Diller was recognized 3 times for excellent police duty. He was respected in his community and deeply loved, as seen in the tremendous outpouring of support during his funeral and wake services last week. Let us remember the sacrifices that he made and the lives he touched. We in this chamber need to make clear our complete support for the brave men and women who proudly wear the badge, risking their lives to keep our communities safe. I offer my sincerest condolences to Jonathan's wife, family, and the NYPD community. To those members of law enforcement and first responders in New York, in New Jersey, and across our country, stay safe and know that we are with you. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield some time to a good friend, a fellow New Yorker, and someone throughout his career in public service has always supported law enforcement, whether as a state legislator, as a county executive, Mr. Molinaro from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. D'Esposito, not only for today's special order, but for a lifetime of service and sacrifice on behalf of the people of the city of New York and his own community. He knows firsthand the sacrifice that men and women in law enforcement make every day. And, by the way, by extension, the sacrifice their families have to offer in that service. We first today, I certainly rise in support and recognition and extend my love and prayers to the family of NYPD Officer Jonathan Diller. We heard some powerful words from his widow, reminding us how absolutely important it is that we establish policy that protect men and women in law enforcement. And instead, time and time again in the state of New York, certainly, but across the country, too many are passing policies that make the job of law enforcement that much more dangerous, undermining the ability to provide for public safety. We have to remember that Jonathan Diller was killed senselessly by a man who had previously been arrested 21 times in the state of New York. 21 times. I want to speak specifically to New York State's cashless bail policy and some of the laws that have come out of Albany, New York, that have made law enforcement that much more difficult and sadly have made this particular tragedy, the loss of Officer Diller, a sad story that gets told and retold across New York. Since the establishment of cashless bail in New York State's criminal justice system has acted as a revolving door for repeat offenders. What New York has done is, instead of taking the smart way of ensuring judicial discretion, the ability to evaluate risk, and, by the way, giving local law enforcement the ability to intervene with the appropriate tools to de-escalate and to end recidivism, New York threw that all out. And the state of New York instead established a policy that emboldens criminals. Now, the response from leaders in Albany and New York and some across the country is that crime is on the decline. They point to arrest statistics as a suggestion that somehow crime is going down. Now, in places like New York, arrests aren't being made. Why? Because small business owners and main streets across the state, in neighborhoods in New York City, they know not even to bother calling in many cases because the law enforcement community is unable to respond to even the simplest of crimes. And because of that, they consistently see the escalation of crime. And those who are committed lower-level offenses sooner or later are committing higher-level offenses and maybe even taking the life of a law enforcement official, and then it's too late. 21 times that person was arrested and released before killing Officer Diller. 21 times the criminal justice system had the ability in the state of New York, if it only had the backing of policymakers, had the ability to intervene and to protect Officer Diller and the 20-plus victims that came before him. Officer Diller's death is just one more example of how incomprehensible the decision to eliminate cashless to eliminate cash bail throughout New York has made our state, my state, a community that I have served since 1994 as a whole more dangerous for men and women, small business owners and families. And we know it. For the State of the Union, I brought 2 upstate county sheriffs. They know firsthand how crime has continued to rise and violence continue to escalate. Because of decisions out of Albany, New York, the governor, state legislators, Democrats empowered one-party rule in my state. New York is more dangerous, and the ability to provide for public safety that much more difficult. And under current law, instead of receiving the innovative services and programs which help to discourage recidivism and empower law enforcement officials to intervene at the right moment, instead of doing that, those apprehended due to criminal activity are free to reoffend. And because of it, they are back out on the streets within moments, if not immediately, creating more victims, committing more crimes, undermining community safety, and by the way, even putting their own ability to find their way to a life free of crime, putting that at risk. Now, while touted as progressive, New York State's bail reform is anything but. New York State's cashless bail is not progressive. It is cruel, and it is dangerous. And it has put the lives of too many New Yorkers, including the life of Jonathan Diller, at risk. The first rule of policymaking is to do no harm. And cashless bail in the state of New York has only produced harm. Albany's bail reform experiment has failed. And yet the politicians in the state of New York continue to avoid the necessary question to revisit this disaster of a policy. It is time that lawmakers in Washington and lawmakers in state capitals across this country, like in Albany, prioritize public safety, prioritize supporting law enforcement, and end senseless tragedies. Prior to coming to Congress, I spent 12 years as a county executive where we focused on intervention, prevention, and diversion tools, giving law enforcement the capacity to make communities safer. New York State threw it all out, and with it has made our communities less safe and the work of law enforcement more dangerous. I join my colleagues in expressing our deepest sympathy and extend our love to the family of Officer Diller, but also to the men and women in law enforcement across New York and across America and their families. May they come home to families that love them and ultimately communities and governments that support them. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I think we've heard this evening from members of this body from throughout the country that we are faced with a problem. And the problem is that in far too many places, in far too many progressive Democrat cities and states, we have chosen to put criminals ahead of law-abiding citizens. And throughout the last couple of weeks, many of us who support law enforcement and support the repeal of cashless bail have heard from naysayers talking about gun violence and that Republicans should focus more on banning certain types of weapons. And I want to point out that in a place like New York, we have on the books some of the strictest gun laws in the country. I've taken myself hundreds of guns off the street as a New York City detective, and I will tell you that there was one thing in common with those hundreds of arrests for firearms. Never once was I presented with a license to carry it. You see, the guns being used to kill people throughout this country are illegal firearms, illegal handguns. Just weeks ago, the Committee on House Administration held a hearing talking about the violence here in the nation's capital. And we again, from the other side of the aisle, were poised with the questions, well, what about banning certain types of guns? And we heard from law enforcement professionals with almost 80 years of combined service They gave us the facts, and they said of the hundreds of guns recovered, over 90% of them were illegal handguns. You see no signs in cities that say a no handgun zone. That's not going to solve the problem. Banning certain types of weapons, those aren't the weapons that are killing people. Those are not the weapons that killed a brave hero and detective from New York City. What we need is to have district attorneys actually enforce the law, actually live up to the oath that they took to be the highest ranking law enforcement officer in their jurisdiction. Not someone like in New York City and Manhattan. We have a rogue DA by the name of Alvin Bragg, who even before he took his oath of office, he thought that it was his job not to enforce the laws, but in New York apparently rewrite the penal code and only enforce those laws that he deemed necessary. Well, we see where that ended up. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleagues from across this country who joined with me here this evening to salute Detective First Grade Jonathan Diller. You see, when I took the oath to become a member of the NYPD, I raised my right hand and I swore to protect and serve. But I also made a promise, and that's the same promise that law enforcement officers make throughout this country when they take their oath, and that is to never, ever, ever forget our fallen brothers and sisters. And for those on the other side of the aisle, in state houses throughout this country and in this chamber, and our colleagues on the other side of the House, who think that the failed progressive policies that they've put in place are actually working, I asked them to do one thing. I remember the night when officers Ramos and Liu were shot and killed in Brooklyn, New York. And I heard the radio transmissions. I've listened to the radio transmission of Officer Diller and his partner just weeks ago when they were at what they thought was just a routine car stop. When you hear Officer Diller yell into the radio that he had been shot, I ask my colleagues who think that these failed policies aren't putting people in danger, sit down and listen to those blood-curdling radio transmissions. And Mr. Speaker, in just a few weeks from now, there will be thousands, tens of thousands of law enforcement agencies from throughout this country. They will make their way to Capitol Hill. And just the other day, they began to engrave the names of fallen officers from throughout this nation on our law enforcement officers' memorial. And we will gather. We'll gather on the lawn for the vigil. And we will commemorate and pay homage to every single member of law enforcement who died in the line of duty. On the statue at the Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, there's a beautiful statue of a lion. And underneath that lion, there's a simple quote. And it says, "It's not how these officers died that make them heroes. It's how they lived." Mr. Speaker, it is not how Detective First Grade Jonathan Diller died that made him a hero. It's also how he lived. He was a loving father, a giving husband, someone who surrounded himself with friends who wanted to be near him because he made them laugh. He made them feel special. And even with just a few years on the job, he went out into some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city of New York and did real police work. He was willing to stop those cars, to take those illegal guns off the street, even when he knew that district attorneys wouldn't do their best to prosecute. He went out there and did God's work. He did the work that he took the oath and swore that he would do. So, Mr. Speaker, again, I thank my colleagues for sharing this hour, not only with me, but with the family of Detective Diller, with members of law enforcement throughout this country, and with the NYPD. And every night I pray for the mayor of the city of New York, Mayor Adams, our police commissioner, Eddie Caban, and the hierarchy of the NYPD, and the rank and file, the men and women who go out there each and every day to do that great work. You see, the men and women that we've honored tonight, it's not how they died that made them heroes, it's how they lived. And I want to thank all law enforcement officers throughout this country, whether it's right here in this beautiful Capitol building and the Capitol Police that protect us each and every day, to the counties, the cities, the villages, the states, from sea to shining sea. Stay safe and realize that in a country where each and every night we watch the news and seems like in our social media streams that all elected officials are fighting against the good work of law enforcement, there are good people that are praying for them, that are rooting for them, that are making sure that they have the resources each and every day to do the job that they need to do. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I reserve.
Does the gentleman yield?
I yield.